Okay. Greetings, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I know it's the coldest night of the year so far, so I'm very impressed with you with ladies in person. We have quite a few people online, I think about 20 or so. Is that about right, Kelly?
There's 53 participants here.
Okay. Excellent. So we've got a few people online, we've got people in the room, that's good. Over time, I really hope the crowd in the room will build, because if it stays too small, we really can't stay doing this for too long. We'll have to stop going online as well. So, first of all, just to explain here, obviously, new venue, haven't been here before. If the fire alarm goes off, then there is a fire exit down those stairs, there is a fire exit down the main stairs beside the lift, and the lift itself may continue working for a little while. We don't know for sure. Just gather straight outside the front if there's a problem. We'll try and make sure you head count, make sure you haven't missed anybody. If anybody needs the loos, they're directly opposite the door, down the little passage opposite, and then on the right. There's 3 different loos down there. We'll have a break in 20 or so minutes. I'm going to give you drinks and snacks and all the other nice things you get when you come here. I'm very thankful to Pharmacology for hosting us. New venue, hopefully this will be really good. We're hoping that someone will come out on the balcony at least for socialising before and during the break. At the very end of the night, I'm going to be fairly prompt in winding up because we have to be out of the building by 9 and we get locked in. That means our clear up time takes time. So please don't try and talk to us while we're clearing up. We won't be able to talk to you at all. We're just going to have to scurry on. We don't know how long it'll take. We know roughly what we'll achieve. In terms of the evening tonight, I was absolutely delighted when one of our previous speakers, John Parrington, agreed to come and talk, not least because this is the department he works in. He's an associate professor here in pharmacology. He's also the head of science communication for the department as well, so this is perfect for proving that he's still doing his job. He's director of research in pharmacology at Worcester. He's also, over the years that we've had him in the cafe, sometimes become.
How we kick them out?
Yeah, if you want to carry on.
He's also become an author and has started writing general science communication books. And although I'm afraid OUP let him down tonight, so we don't have copies that we can sell, he is talking tonight on the subject of his newest book, the same title as the talk. And I'm going to send round his contact details after on the mailing list that if anybody would like to directly contact him for a book. Fairly obviously you can buy the book as well, as indeed you can his previous ones. And he will have another coming out in October next year, which will develop this theme a bit further. But buying direct from the author, some of you may know, is always a great way to make them very happy. Okay.
Where are we showing the screen?
Just showing this one, not trying to do anything else. It's too complicated. So I'm afraid the people online know you can just see what you can see up here. That's as good as it gets. We don't have any other options at the moment. For those online, please keep yourselves muted. We do have a speaker system set up in here, just one speaker, but hopefully it should mean that everybody's hearable. I'm going to ask John to put a headset mic, just going to hang around his neck.
Sorry, Rachel, could you put the microphone on as people are saying that they can't hear you?
Oh, okay. Let me go and grab one of them. Where did you put them near?
They're just behind the speaker.
Thank you. Sorry about this, guys. We think this is the right one. Can you hear that? Let me turn up. I'm going to just turn up the maximum volume. There we go. Is that better?
Can you all hear? Nod if you can. Thumbs up. Yeah.
Yeah. Giving thumbs up from people online.
Yep.
Good. So we're going to ask John to wear the speaker as well, the microphone as well, so that everyone can hear, which should help. As you can see, getting used to a new venue where we have to be heard in a different way is going to take some time for us as well. So please bear with us. So I'm going to shut up now and say a very big thank you in advance to John Parrington. Over to you. So if you hang that around your neck. Just around, so that should be close enough.
It might be
Mine is not very good.
Don't worry. Alright. Am I talking?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Try again.
Hello, that's better. That's right.
That's the blue launch interview.
Right, well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I'm sure you can all hear me now. Yes, I'm going to talk today about my recent book, Mind Shift. And actually, I've just been working on another one called Consciousness, which is going to be out in October. So they're kind of similar themes. And I've been thinking about the kind of problem of consciousness for quite a while, really. So it's been a kind of culmination of some ideas I've been working on for some years, really. But what I really want to think about in terms of trying to understand the scientific basis for human consciousness was thinking about the different kind of roots of consciousness, because obviously consciousness is a subject that people have been debating, well, at least since Aristotle, probably long before that, before we could even record our thoughts on reading that paper. You can see that, by the way, but the trees are a bit in the way. But and I think the key kind of thing for me as a scientist is to think that what are the biological roots of consciousness, human consciousness, and what role do does the environment play? Because clearly we are quite unusual. I'll go into ways of why we're unusual as a species, and then our social environment is really quite, I would say, quite different to that of any other species. Of course, we've got to think then about what we mean by consciousness in a general sense, also then in a more individual sense. So I want to think about individual choices and the ways that individual consciousness might develop within a species like ours. Something that really got me interested in this particular area was thinking about what made humans different from animals. So this is showing our evolution as a species, and actually one thing that I think is really quite unusual about the way we have developed is the way we often tend to focus on the mind as being this kind of thing that sets us apart from the species, and yet there's actually evidence really that it was more our hands that really led to our path, being very distinct to the species. In fact, it was not personally normally associated with this kind of area of science, but Friedrich Engels, you may know, was a kind of friend and colleague of Karl Marx. He's more thought of as a political thinker. He was, as far as I know, the first person to really set forth the correct path of human evolution in writing. So what Engels said, recognised, was that what really set us on our path that made us distinct to species was that human ancestors descended from the trees, started walking on two legs. That then freed up the hands to using tools, and this then set in train all sorts of interesting developments, particularly language. So Engels thought it was important that once we started using tools to work upon the environment and change the environment, then it became important to do this in a social way, to interact socially. And this led to the development of language. And then both of these things, this use of tools to transform the environment around us, but also the development of language, started then to impact on the human brain, and that's how we ended up with a much bigger brain than you'd expect for a primate of our size. And although we tend to focus on the size of the human brain, I would argue there's now increasing evidence that our brains are structured in very, very differently from other species. So that then brings us to the question then of, how can we relate all this to what's going on in the brain? And so this kind of emphasis on the role of language and also the way that tools have affected the way we interact with the world and our consciousness. Key themes in the book, but what I also wanted to do in the book was then relate that to what might be going on in the brain. Particularly thinking then about how the different cells of the brain, the different cells of the brain, are the basis of our consciousness. And although we tend to focus on neurons as being the kind of key kind of part of how the brain works, what we're also starting to realise is that the so-called glial cells, which for a time people thought would only play a very kind of passive supporting role in the brain, actually turn out to be really important cells in their own right. So it's this interaction between neurons and glia that I look at in the book. And also, as a geneticist, I'm very interested in the way that the genome is involved in all this. So my first book, The Deeper Genome, looked at what's known about the complexity of the genome. So this idea that the genome is really just about coding genes is being challenged by new evidence showing that actually there's a lot more to the genome than simply the DNA code. And in particular, RNA, chemical cousin of DNA, is shown to have very important roles. And particularly in the brain, it turns out that RNA actually plays really quite important key roles. And also, I think this new science of epigenetics, that's not that new, I think it was a guy called Conrad Waddington who first coined the term back in the mid-20th century, but the science of epigenetics, which emphasizes everything that happens to the genome that's not DNA code. We're also starting to realize just what an intimate link there is between the environment and the genome. In some quite kind of quite attractive ways. So I look at all the ways in which these different aspects of biology then form, help to form our consciousness. But what I also wanted to really do then in the book was to look at some of the kind of key aspects of consciousness, building on this kind of framework of the role of language and tool use, but also thinking about the basic biology of the brain. And then start thinking about how some key aspects of consciousness, like thoughts, memories, our creativity, our imagination, are affected by this transforming role, what I call a mind shift that's happened through the influence of language and tool use on our minds. And of course, these are things that we can find in an animal consciousness. I mean, animals have thoughts, their memories, they're very creative in all sorts of interesting ways. But what I argue is really quite different. It's the way that language has transformed practically everything about our brains in really quite important ways. And of course, we've got to factor in the fact that we're not simply individuals, despite what Margaret Thatcher said about there's no such thing as society, it's just individuals. Actually, human society has been a kind of key thing, way back into our prehistoric past. And what I would argue really quite different about human society is this role of language and the fact we basically convey ideas and concepts. I argue in the book that's really quite a unique thing, this conceptual thinking, structured by language. That's had a massive impact on the way our society has developed. And it also means that society itself has a huge impact on the way that a human child, for instance, grows up within human society and the way its consciousness develops. Now, one thing I don't think we can ignore in thinking about consciousness is the unconscious. To some extent, this is a fairly kind of non-problematic, controversial idea that a lot of what goes on in our minds is unconscious. Just imagine going to work in the morning, you may be driving a car to work, you may be thinking about the meal you're going to cook that evening, an argument you had with a spouse or a partner or a friend the night before. You're obviously, hopefully, concentrating on the road ahead as you drive along, but there'll probably be aspects of that journey, particularly if it's a kind of a regular one, that will be partially unconscious. And a lot of what we do without even thinking about it, our movements and all these things, can also be said to be unconscious. But what I would argue is a more controversial idea is that there's another kind of aspect of consciousness, the one that's more associated with Sigmund Freud, where there's unconscious repressed feelings, desires, and these can have major influences on our behaviour and our thoughts without us necessarily realising the full extent to which they're influences. Now, Freud's a controversial figure. Some people think he was a really major kind of thinker in psychology. Other people think he was a complete charlatan. It can be quite a polarised point of view. My personal point of view is that I think Freud many of his ideas are very much a product of the times. What he said about sexuality and stage of development, I think now seems quite crude and probably quite sexist, really. But I do think the kind of one aspect of Freud that is interesting is the kind of dynamic, the way he sees the unconscious is a very dynamic entity, and the mind in general is dynamic. What I've tried to do in the book is to think about some of the things that Freud said about the dynamic unconscious, and then try and relate that to what I've said elsewhere about the important role of language. Now, one thing that you can ignore in any kind of book about consciousness is what we might call mental disorders. Actually, the very term mental disorder itself there's quite a debate about whether we call it an illness or a disorder or simply mental distress. And I think this reflects the fact there's a huge debate really about what exactly is the cause of certain mental disorders. Schizophrenia, serious clinical depression, so on and so forth. And what I've tried to do in the book is to try and steer a path between two points of view that I see as equally kind of erroneous. One is just to see everything in the genes. Everything is just biology, it's just genes. So say schizophrenia is really just a disease of the mind. It is down to faulty genes, that kind of thing. And I think the problem with that kind of point of view is that the more we've looked in terms of genetic searches for genetic links to a condition like schizophrenia, the more we realise just how complex that is. So it's not that there aren't important genetic kind of influences there, but the idea there might be some kind of simple schizophrenia genes really doesn't hold up. But I think there's an equally mistaken view of looking at this issue, and that's to say that biology doesn't matter at all, and it's really just about environment. If you've had a traumatic upbringing, if you've been abused as a child, this is really the kind of thing that makes you become mentally distressed later in life. And I think what we really need to do is to try and steer a path between these, what I see as two extremes, and instead try and think how that interaction between slight biological differences between people, genetic differences between people, but then very much the role of the environment in structuring our consciousness, and how those two things can interact. In general, for us to develop in a kind of healthy, fruitful way, but sometimes in other ways to end up in a really quite serious condition like schizophrenia. And I look at some of the evidence for both the biological roots of that and also, as I said, the environment. And I think what's interesting is that the more we start to look at this question of how epigenetics is a key part of how we function, how the brain functions, is to see that this whole idea of what we sometimes call this division between nature and nurture in itself is a false division, because actually things that happen could be way back in when you're in the womb, but also things that happen to you when you were a child can have a major impact on say, our genomes. And so it means that even kind of quite clear environmental stimuli, trauma, the rest of it, can have quite a big impact on biology. So to sort of separate nature from nurture, I think, is a mistake. And this is particularly, I think, the case when we start then to even define what we mean by disorder, because, for instance, autistic spectrum disorder is autism spectrum disorder is defining it as a disorder, and it's quite clear that it's the reason it's called a spectrum, because there's a huge kind of diversity of conditions that we look within this title. ADHD is another one. My son was diagnosed with ADHD. We tend to define these as disorders, and yet you only have to look at the spectrum to see, well, actually, there's a huge amount of evidence of creative individuals, autistic, the creative industries, film, and that kind of thing, they're absolutely full of people with being diagnosed with ADHD. So I think what that really shows is that even defining something as a disorder can to some extent reflect on the fact that actually there's all sorts of positive aspects of these so-called disorders. The problem we face in trying to understand them from a biological point of view and also from the root of these conditions is to try and separate what we see as the kind of negative and the positive aspects, but also to recognise that as they are in a spectrum, it can very much the environment and the context that can make a difference to whether something is seen as a problem or actually something that is probably quite important to the whole human race. You know, and I think we're starting to realise that for practically every so-called disorder, there's a kind of positive aspect. We can maybe talk about that later on. One thing, and I thought I'd just throw this in as a kind of an aside really, where I don't think we would say that there's a kind of generally positive thing about a mental condition is criminal psychopaths. And I mentioned this partly because I was interviewed recently for a documentary that's been made about the serial killer Ian Brady, one of the so-called morals murderers, and that should be appearing on Amazon in spring. And it was an interesting thing to take part in that because I've never been that involved in it. Literally the camera kind of on me, and I had to sort of try and dredge out my mind what I thought about the subject. But what they really wanted me to tell them was, why is it that this horrible, horrific serial murder ended up the way it was? And as I said to them, really, the difficulty is in a specific individual like that is there's so many potential variables, and we know so little about his brain and his DNA and the rest of it. But we can draw some interesting conclusions from looking in general at serial killers. And one thing that seems to be quite different, at least amongst these individuals, is that there does seem to be a difference in terms of the connectivity in different parts of the brain, so things like the amygdala, which is particularly involved in emotion, the fear response, that kind of thing. The idea that, you know, when you see somebody who's suffering, you will normally also feel horrified, you want to stop that suffering. With a serial killer, it doesn't seem to work like that. So this whole thing about how the different parts of the brain interact, I think, is an interesting question in terms of clearly very psychopathic individuals. But it's also something I developed more generally in the book, actually, about new evidence showing that how the different parts of the brain interact seems to be linked to how brainwaves of different frequencies structure events within the brain, they're linked within the brain. And so if we want to get a grip, I think, on some of any really abnormal condition, I've already said that we've got to be careful in using the word abnormal and disorder, but any kind of, it's clearly an abnormal condition. Think about how that kind of connectivity is maybe brought down in some circumstances. Another thing I really wanted to deal with in the book, and I think it's an interesting point that you don't often get in many books like consciousness, is it sometimes presented as if human consciousness is just this thing that's always been there since time immemorial. And I wanted to get a feel for how specific types of societies have affected consciousness. Because what's kind of interesting us as a species is that although we started life way back in the savannah, in these hunter-gatherer groups, so for most of our time on Earth we were in these hunter-gatherer groups where kind of small bands of people, quite primitive technologies compared to what we're used to now, and yet apparently very equal societies, very little sense in which men dominate women, or very little kind of, there is conflict, but they kind of find ways to diffuse this. In general, quite happy societies, although of course they've got all the problems of dealing with society without medicine and all these things at the mercy of the environment in some ways. But yeah, from that we've come to a very different kind of society, a class society that we're now living, where on the one hand we've got these amazing technologies, things that we could have, previous kind of ages could only have dreamed of, and yet there's a clear kind of divisions in society. We have things like racism, sex, and all the kind of conflicts, look at the war and so I wanted to look a little bit about how that might affect our consciousness, and to kind of go into that. But also to then look at what happens when people start to rebel against that kind of science, and then those can happen to mention it now, given we're kind of heading for this wave of strikes, for instance. But what I also wanted to do in the book was to kind of broaden out this idea about what it means for our minds to be culturally trained, transformed, because the subtitle of the book is how culture is transformed in the brain. And I've already said that language plays a key role in this. But of course, there's more to do with culture than simply words. For instance, we have art, music, we have written words, as just
sorry, I don't know how we do that.
The trouble is, it's a while since we've done this, isn't it?
It is.
I do this partly by looking at the ways in which people receive great art, they interpret art, how they kind of listen to music, what it does to their minds, but also the ways in which great art, great music, great literature might have come out of some quite interesting kind of specific kinds of consciousness. I look, for instance, at Emily Bronte's book Wuthering Heights, which is one of my favourite authors, and look at, to some extent, there's some evidence that great work, I see it's an incredible work of literature, when it came out in the mid-19th century, really quite shocking for many people, this kind of image of this kind of wild kind of relationship between Cathy and Heathcliff. She may have come to some extent out of trauma. She'd been through a lot of trauma in her family. She lost sisters, she lost her brother, she lost her brother. And in some ways that kind of negative trauma, that really kind of horrible things that happened to her, to some extent influenced her out. I don't know if any of this is novel or new, but what I wanted to do in the book was to try and find ways I connected with what I said the rest of the book about consciousness. And that brought me on to science, because as a scientist I've always been fascinated about the differences between art and science. We tend to distinguish them as being very different but actually, the more we look at them, the more we look at science and actually the things that go into science and what gives people these great scientific ideas, is to see actually there's many similarities in terms of the creative impulses. So it's not really just about hard facts, there's lots of roles there for intuition and that kind of thing. Talk about some ways in which that kind of intuitive aspect of science is a key part of science, but it's also very much linked to, like I said, that consciousness. And that brings me up to one of my final points then, is to think about, will there ever be artificial forms of consciousness? It's quite a topical issue. We hear quite a lot about the threat of AI, whether it's going to, robots are going to take over the world, and people like Elon Musk and so on. And I think one of the problems we face here actually in trying to understand the real potential, but also the threat of AI, is that we do live in a society where I think you could argue that people are quite alienated to some extent from things we produce. So that this is a concept to develop when I'm talking about the ways in which capitalist society has influenced thought, that you could argue that we live in quite an alienated existence, in that we particularly the capitalist productive process, it tends to atomize people, it tends to kind of make people sometimes feel like a cog in a machine. And certainly Karl Marx developed this idea in thinking more generally about how alienation might affect society, might make us see each other as objects rather than kind of people like ourselves, that kind of, but also the things we produce as being potentially a threat rather than actually the great potential things that we produce as human beings, and actually just tools. And I think one thing that's important to say about artificial intelligence is, on the one hand, I think a lot of the kind of claims that it's going to, computers are soon going to kind of take over the world and rule us and dominate us, is based on an underestimation of the complexity of the human brain and the problems in trying to create that in a computer. And secondly, also a sense that these are, at the end of the day, that tools are being created by human beings. And of course, the way they can be used in all sorts of horrible ways. Look at what's happening in the Ukraine at the moment with the way that drones have been used to attack and kill people. But I think ultimately that's about human interactions, human choices, and I think it's very important that we don't forget that at the end of the day, these are tools that we create and how we use them is very much a human decision and human choice. And that really brings me to my final point that I wanted to make. So I was going to talk a bit about religion and spirituality. I won't mention it now, so I don't want to take up too much time. But what I really wanted to end with really was by talking about, I think, a dichotomy we face at the moment in terms of human existence. On the one hand, an absolutely amazing development of technologies that past generations could not have dreamed of, like great transport systems, like great cities, the fact we could send rockets to Mars, and we talk about that, great colony on Mars, that kind of thing, which has all come out in the human mind, which is pretty amazing when you think this is, something that's a bit larger than a bag of sugar, has a consistency of cold porridge, and yet it's got all these amazing things. And yet, I think most people would agree that we are in a situation where if we carry on the path we're going, with an unsustainable kind of mode of existence that is pumping more and more CO2 into the atmosphere, we are heading for disaster in the form of global warming, but also the extinctions of species on an unprecedented scale, pollution and nuclear war, all these pose real challenges to whether we're going to carry on as this species that's going to be dominating the rest of the planet for the millennia. And I think that begs us to then think about our minds and how our consciousness developed from our hunter-gatherer origins, but then to think about, well, how can we build a sustainable, ethical and fair society? And I think to some extent that means then looking into the ways that we are unique as human beings and to recognise that we have a great responsibility, partly because we're the only species on the planet, have this ability to conceptualise, to plan, to rationalise. I'm not saying that other animals don't have all sorts of amazing abilities, but we're the only species, I would argue, that because of our conceptual thought, we can plan ahead, we can really do things in a rational way. And how we use that as a society, how we use that as a species, is obviously very much up to us. And it's amazing thing that we've got this consciousness that allows us to make this choice, hopefully for the better in the future, and build that kind of sustainable, fair society. Thank you.
If I've got the right one, this won't give problems with interference. Excellent. Thank you very much. It is 7:55 now, so we'll take a little kind of 5-8 minute break, something like that. We might have a go in the second half of the discussion at seeing if John can use the microphone instead, because that might be a way to avoid the problems with people online not hearing, but we'll give that a try. We're just trying things out tonight, so as I said before, please bear with us. Thank you again, John. Let's take a little break. Please help yourselves, guys, to snacks and drinks. Yeah, we might try to have some online revolution, so although we change the time. Just remember it's John. John,
It's a lovely location.
it's absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, somebody.
Okay, so we've got our two mics now, normal roving mics. We'll do the usual in the room, in that if people want to make a comment or ask a question, we will bring a mic to you. Please wait until we get to you, because this way everybody in the room and online can hear. Can you give Kelly a thumbs up online if you can hear me clearly? Anybody online want to do a thumbs up to show you can hear? I'm hoping you can.
Most of them can.
Oh, it doesn't. We don't need to wait for all of them. And John? Can you speak as well?
Yeah, can you hear me? Is that better?
Do you want to turn it up a tiny bit? He's got a deeper voice than me. Okay. All right. Good. Okay. So we'll have a go at that then. I'm going to kick off. So host privilege on this one. It was very interesting when you said that childhood traumas could affect you were talking, I think, in evolutionary terms more about the brain, but I wanted to know, are there things you specifically look for that are actual changes in the brain that could show the impact of something that's happened to somebody on the way their brain's developed, without showing the developing brain, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's interesting is just how early some of this trauma can affect a person's later development. So there have been, as I said, that when we've looked for genes that are linked to schizophrenia, the picture that emerges is a very complex one. There's not a clear schizophrenia gene that is, and if anything, these genetic differences have quite a small effect on the actual chance of getting the disease, supposedly. But there was an interesting study I read where they found that it wasn't actually in the brain as such that there were these genetic differences, but genes that were predisposing a woman to preeclampsia, so problems with the placenta. So there were actually genes that were involved in placental development. And what the link seemed to be is that if a woman was had problems in a kind of interaction with her fetus through the placenta, and preeclampsia is a condition where you have a particular problem with this, that seemed to be then linked to a more increased risk of schizophrenia in the child that developed from that. So there you've got a potential trauma going on there in the womb that's actually having an impact, and the condition that only really develops in late teen, kind of early adulthood. So I think that shows how early the trauma can be in its effects. In terms of childhood development, there's, I think, good evidence that, you know, lack of nurturing, lack of interaction with people speaking to you, you know, developing your language skills can have a big impact. And there was a study of children in Romanian orphanages. It turned out that, you know, after the Romanian dictatorship collapsed, they found all these children in these orphanages that had been basically just left to their own devices. There was very little interaction with their carers. There was just not the resources to look after these kids properly. And it had a massive impact on the development, the language development, the kind of intelligence, that kind of thing. They just seem as if there's a kind of reversibility to this if you kind of tackle it early enough. So I think what it shows is that trauma can have big impacts on our genomes, on our brain biology, and definitely on our kind of mental development. But, you know, there's also, with these studies, I think one of the problems with them, they tend to focus on the negatives, they tend to focus on trauma, anxiety, all these things. Whereas in fact, I think there's also other evidence that shows that positive life experiences, positive diet, positive interactions can have an equally important effect. And so that's probably one reason why it's possible reversing these effects, because actually it's positive and negatives both have key roles. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I was also wondering really about the actual biological changes. What is it you can detect in the brain that suggests that environment has had an impact on it? And just before you answer, I'm just going to remind everybody, these are directional. They don't work if you do that. You have to point them at your mouth like Lady Gaga. Thank you.
That's me as well, actually. I mean, there are definitely differences that we can look at. I mean, you know, there's a big debate about what makes a serial killer. Is it, you know, trauma in early life, or is it some genetics that really makes them hardwired to become a killer? And I think there's probably a bit of both, really. And in fact, that in itself is interesting, because of course we can say that something's deterministic, you know, that is the brain biology is what makes them the killer. But it's not as simple as that. There's actually a criminologist, a psychologist who looks at these psychopathic criminals called Adrian Raine, who works in the States, and he spent most of his career looking at criminal psychopaths' brains, and he's found the kind of things I mentioned about this dysfunctional link between the amygdala and the parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and that seems to be one reason why some of these people, they lack empathy, they're more likely to not feel anything when they're killing someone. But then he did a test on himself, he did the same test on himself, and he found pretty similar things there. And it turned out he had been, you know, involved in a gang when he was a child, and he'd been involved in some quite kind of juvenile delinquent behaviour. So I guess that raises the question, you know, if you've got a person whose brain, a serial killer whose brain looks like this, and then you do an imaging of the professor who's studying them, and they look pretty similar, what does that mean in terms of determinism? So yeah, there are some interesting changing differences, but I think it still begs the question: why is it that certain people go in one direction and other people in another? And I think that applies to conditions like schizophrenia and depression, and as well as to, you know, criminal psychopaths, really. So we're trying to pin down exactly what it is that pushes people in that direction rather than other. I think we still don't fully understand. And I suspect it's because we don't really fully understand the dynamics of brain consciousness yet, and we're only just starting to get a grip on that. But actually, that's the bit where I think it's looking quite exciting. So this new study is showing how brainwaves of different frequencies connect different parts of the brain. I think we're finally starting to get a handle on specifically how it is that these different regions interact, and I think that will give us massive clues about what might be going on when we have a so-called abnormal brain.
What a fantastic bit of research as well to find out he looked the same his brain as a serial killer. Do we have anyone in the room with a comment or a question or an idea? Kelly's having a look to see if there's anybody on the chat with anything specific.
There's nobody currently.
Nobody currently. Sorry, I'm going to carry on then.
Oh, wait a minute.
Yeah?
There's a question that came like a second ago. Is there any evidence that iPhone and computer use preoccupation of young children's brains are adversely affected?
Did you get that?
No, I didn't, sorry.
is there any evidence that iPhone and computer use in particularly young people's brains, that makes their brains adversely affected?
Okay, so this is an interesting question, because actually one of the people who kind of inspired me when I was writing this book to think more about this role of brainwaves is a scientist called Earl Miller, and he works at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston, and he's done some fascinating work looking at how monkey brains are wired, but in a kind of dynamical way, and he's found this role for these brainwaves of different frequencies when a monkey is carrying out what we call working memory. So this is the thing, imagine you're trying to juggle various bits of information in your head. It could be several phone numbers, but it could equally be a task. Imagine you're at an airport and you're thinking about the flight you've got to catch, maybe you want to get a meal, you're doing some shopping, you've got to remember where all your things are. That's kind of working memory. It's kind of keeping all these things in your head at once. And it turns out that monkeys have pretty similar impulses when it comes to being able to, when you give a monkey a task which involves them having to remember different things at once, that involves some really quite sophisticated interactions in the brain, and he's been able to map these and even show that specific frequencies have specific roles in that process. And he thinks that this is relevant not just for human beings, and there is some increasing evidence that this is definitely what's going on in the human mind. But I would argue with that, I would add it with that added kind of role of language. But also he's then started to look at what happens when you have too much information. And he's shown that if you overload the brain with information, that can have quite a detrimental effect on working memory. And I think because these brainwaves also seem to regulate all sorts of other things, not just working memory, but practically everything about our minds and our consciousness, these waves are playing an important role. Overload of information, I think, can be really quite a problem. So although we can really think what an amazing thing it is in modern society that we do have all this kind of access to information through the internet, I think there are aspects of it that can be quite problematic, and particularly the way that our young people are bombarded with information from, I've got children who are teenagers, they've kind of been exposed to that kind of 24/7 kind of culture, really, being connected to the internet. It does raise issues about some of the more problematic aspects of that. I think, like anything, there's a positive and a negative aspect. I mean, the wealth of kind of access young people have to all sorts of things we wouldn't have dreamed of via the internet. And of course that can be positive, it can be kind of connecting with friends, it can be getting involved in political debate and trying to change the world. But equally, I think that the fact they are bombarded with all these kind of different aspects of culture, and some of which can be quite negative, is a problem. I mean, it's certainly an issue, when I was talking to my daughter about kind of what it's like to be always connected, she was talking about this pressure to have a certain image, to have a certain body image. Luckily, she's not into taking selfies and showing them, but I think there is an issue there about the ways in which this can be, well, both a problem in terms of consciousness, like how do you cope with all this information, but also some of the more negative aspects of those images is a potential problem. And I think it's maybe one of the reasons why young people, there seems to be an increase in mental distress, mental disorders, particularly amongst young women, which we do have to kind of think about without demonising the internet and saying it's all the fault of social media and the rest of it.
Just a bit of a follow-up to that. I thought it's very interesting what you were saying about working memory and that we can overload it. One of the things I see a lot with students is them particularly feeling, and colleagues as well actually, feeling what they would call stressed when under intense pressure because there's so much going on. Could this have perhaps some connection with people feeling that there's an overwhelming burden of whatever emotion or jobs or tasks or pressures in their life? It's become kind of cluttering up their main working brain, and that is the reason why they feel, I need to take a break, I need to have some time out, I feel under so much stress I have to make a change, without necessarily going into something as big as depression. But I think a lot of us feel that sense of pressure occasionally, which is almost overwhelming. Could that be connected, do you think?
I think there's been a build-up of pressure, hasn't there? In many ways, there's a lot going on. We've got a cost of living crisis, we've got the war, we've got fears about global warming and where it's all leading. And I think all of this can be quite a burden on one's psyche and the way one feels. So whether it's job insecurity or just the general kind of feeling of where's the world kind of going. You know, the pandemic kind of obviously contribute to that, but maybe it also contributes to the idea that sometimes the kind of ways to relax, maybe nearer home than we might think. I think it was a revelation to I mean, I'm speaking here as a middle-class person who had, you know, a garden, and I could run around the park and stuff and that kind of thing. But I think one thing that we realised is we like to go for walks in the countryside. We'd often drive an hour to get to walk and then walk. We realised that you could just do some of this on your back doorstep, really. But I think also that kind of reappraisal of how important nature is, you know, being able to take a walk in the park by being denied it for a time during lockdowns and things, can also make you think about maybe the simpler pleasures in life and how they contribute to, you know, wellness. So I know there's quite a thing now about kind of mindfulness and things. So I think one thing that's interesting thinking about creativity and imagination is this recognition that overthinking, focusing on a problem and only thinking about that problem isn't necessarily the best way to be creative. There's increasing evidence that intuition, as I said, plays an important role in scientific thought, and that's starting to link with what I've been reading about in terms of different parts of the brain that are involved in creativity and imagination. So although we tend to think of creativity and imagination as being these kind of linked to higher centers of the brain, the more human, you know, developed areas like the prefrontal cortex, those kind of ones we associate with rational thought and planning. Actually, there's evidence that when people are going through kind of creative thoughts, other parts of the brain that were formerly not thought to be involved at all, like the cerebellum, may play a role. Now, I think this is important because the cerebellum is a part of the brain that, at the back of the brain, it's always been associated with some fairly basic stuff like repetitive movements. If you learn to play a piano or learn to throw a ball into a net or ride a bicycle, that's the cerebellum that's playing a role there. But there's increasing evidence that it plays an important role in creativity and imagination. And because this is the part of the brain that's very much the unconscious kind of side of you know, developing your mind. When you learn to play a piano, to some extent, it's a kind of, there's an unconscious thing going on there in how you kind of gain that skill. I think that shows that there's probably an unconscious side to creativity and imagination that's really, really quite important, actually. I have a story that really I liked about the woman Lisa Meitner who discovered nuclear fission. And it was actually when she was at her lowest time in her life. She was as a Jew, she'd been forced out of Nazi Germany. She escaped only just with her life. She had no possessions, she'd lost everything. But she was there, I think it was almost like this time of year, it was Christmas Eve. She'd been invited by some people to go and have dinner, and she was walking through this forest. She was dressed only in the clothes. She'd fled Germany and very cold, and she was heading for this Christmas lunch. And she, walking through this snowy forest, she decided to just sit down and rest. And she wasn't probably thinking about anything particular at all. And suddenly this idea for nuclear fission, how it works, came to her. And it was kind of the moment when she was probably least thinking about it, when she had this incredible breakthrough. So I don't think it's I think it was Einstein that said just how important intuition is. So I think, yeah, definitely overthinking things is not necessarily the best way to kind of make sort of a scientific breakthrough, but also in general our lives we can probably gain from that kind of off time. Maybe that's the kind of lesson that we've learned a bit from the pandemic about slowing down a bit.
I'll come over here first.
You talked briefly about the subconscious and showed the 9/10 percentage, and gave the idea that perhaps there was more going on in the subconscious than the conscious. What scientific basis is there in that, and how can that be, measurements can be approached on that question of the influence of the subconscious?
Great, yeah. I mean, I think to a large extent our consciousness is an unconscious. Unless you believe in the soul, and if you want to see it in a purely materialist way, then to some extent we have to explain consciousness in terms of unconscious processes, you know, neuronal processes, synapses, that kind of thing. I think where it becomes interesting from a human point of view is that because language, I've argued that language plays this key role in structuring consciousness, that has implications for how consciousness comes together. And certainly one of the things that influenced me to write the book Mindshift was reading about the work of a psychologist called Lev Vygotsky, who worked in Russia in the 20s and 30s, who really developed this idea. Well, he built on the idea that if tool use is what's allowed us to transform the world, designing and using tools is what makes us unique compared to other species. Obviously, some other species can use and design tools, but not in the systematic kind of way that we do in the range of tools. And he said that if that's true, that one of the things that defines us as a species is using tools to transform the world around us. What if words themselves are a material force in the brain that transform the mind? And he had some quite interesting evidence showing that there's a kind of an inner speech. Words actually been an important part of this, that structures our conscious, structures our thoughts. But there's probably different levels of inner speech. So when I'm trying to answer this question, to kind of pull out my consciousness the kind of an answer that hopefully will make some kind of sense, I'm drawing on my inner kind of speech, but there's probably a much kind of deeper levels of words, of inner speech that are putting much less form. So there's a kind of a spectrum almost of kind of types of inner speech. And the further down you get, the further you get into the unconscious processes, it's probably much more fluid and much more harder to sort of define than the kind of specific types of words I'm using now. And I think there's also other evidence showing that because we are social animals, because we grow up in a society where we're exposed to the language of others, our inner speech is probably very much a dialogue, and it's drawn, and that dialogue is influenced by all the kind of conversations we had in the past with carers and parents and friends and colleagues and the rest of it. And to some extent, that kind of reflects kind of tensions, contradictions in society itself. So I think if you want to look at how that affects our consciousness, we have to say, I think, that our consciousness is as much as social as an individual construct. Even though it's in an individual brain, it's got a social kind of structure. And so it's only by understanding how society itself works and how the contradictions of society themselves are developed and maintained and continue or channeled to whatever, that we can start to grasp just how different that makes our consciousness from animals. Now, how you then connect that with the biology, I think, is the trickiest bit of all. It's kind of what I've been trying to do in the book. And in fact, in the new book I've just finished and will be published in October, I tried to engage even more with those mechanisms, and also what other people have said about the brain, philosophers of mind, psychologists, neuroscientists, and so on and so forth. Probably in a way that I've not done as much in this first book. And I think what that means is then finding a mechanism that can both explain the biology and how the brain works as a whole in the biological sense, with those, I think, more social, more human aspects. And I think the brain waves of different frequencies are key to this, partly because they're the things that really start to connect completely different parts of the brain. But I think they also allow in a role for language that we can add on to any kind of consideration of how it works in say, a monkey brain.
Yep, and you come over.
Do you think that machines at some point, or perhaps even now, have a degree of consciousness based on the way language is progressing so quickly with AI and other streams of technology?
Yeah, great question. And in fact, I think we've got to be careful actually when we underestimate what machines might do in the future, because I think it's been said that artificial intelligence is everything that computers still can't do. Is that right? It's the idea that they may be creeping up on us anyway. I think the problem I have with AI and this idea that it's really becoming close to human consciousness is just how much we can underestimate the complexity of the brain. So on the one hand, we have some quite big differences. I mean, although there are attempts to try and mimic what's going on in the brain with things like these neural networks, that kind of thing, and they'll even talk about synapses and that kind of thing. I think that underestimates what's really going on in the brain, because although it's true to some extent that the brain is a circuit diagram, it is connected neurons in circuits. I think that it underestimates the complexity of those individual units. So it's not true they're just like on-off switches like in a computer. So that's one big difference. all the underlying kind of millions of or even billions of years of evolution that have gone into that mind have an influence, I think, on its workings. And then finally, what I've said about these brainwaves of different frequencies, I find that because it's not a kind of, it's not a series of, it's not like a circuit, is it? That those brainwaves of different frequencies actually pull bits of the brain together in a kind of holistic sense. That again, I think would be difficult to mimic in a machine. Now, that's not to say that you could design a machine that could think in really some quite sophisticated ways and maybe even gain a kind of self-consciousness in a completely different way. And in fact, some AI people say that what they don't want to do is just try and mimic the brain. They want to find ways for this to develop in its own way. But I think there's also probably an overestimation of what's going on when we have, say, machine learning. You know, there was quite a big hoo-ha about the fact that a computer had learned how to beat a grandmaster of this game Go. And I think it was fascinating, the fact that this machine could learn how to beat somebody at a game that was thought to be quite intuitive. It wasn't just like chess, where it wasn't as rule-bound supposedly as chess. I don't know, I'm not an expert on either game really. But I think that misunderstands the fact, the differences with the human brain, where it's true that we can have a person can be a brilliant chess player or a Go player, but of course they can do all sorts of other incredible things with their brain and rapidly move from one thing to another. As far as I know, there's AI systems that can be trained, or they learn how to play like chess or Go, but then you'd have to completely start again if you wanted them to learn something completely different. So it's not like they can just leap from one thing to another. Whereas we might not have played, I don't know, chess or ridden a bike for years and years, and we can somehow, go to that, or we can maybe remember a passage from a book that we might have read years ago, that kind of thing. So I think there's a fluidity and a flexibility of the human brain that is really quite different from that. And also I think probably reflects this really deep biological basis. So I don't think it's enough to say that there's a software and a wetware and somehow that's irrelevant. I think they're quite intimately related, really.
Anybody else? Can I ask something about, I was thinking about, you were talking about the use of computers and society and social media and that kind of thing. One of the things which feels very human is that sense of whether or not you're being appreciated, which is very bound up with social media use nowadays and the things you're saying your daughter worries about. Can you, firstly, is there any clues to what's going on in the brain? Secondly, can you imagine ever AI replicating that kind of sense of how others value you, which feels very human?
It's a big thing, isn't it? It's got a sense of being appreciated, and it probably goes way back to our kind of youth when we first started to learn interactions with other people, and maybe particularly our adolescence and our teenage years, when I think certainly under the influence of hormones, these things, and our sexual development, these things can be very important. And I think that's the other side of things, actually, that is quite different from the machine, that our emotions, so-called emotions, have a very kind of chemical, there's chemicals involved. It's not simply about kind of circuits in the brain. On the other hand, I would also say that every human emotion, even the most supposedly basic ones, have a very kind of, they've got big differences compared to that of an animal. They may be based on the same kind of chemicals, but I think there's big differences. We're starting, I think, to learn that the chemistry of the human brain is quite different in some quite interesting ways, really. So I think to get to the point about, appreciation, how that may be being affected by, changes in social media, I think that's hopefully what I think I got from what you were saying. Maybe every new generation has new challenges. I talk to my daughter about sexuality and transsexuality. I mean, it's quite a big thing. They talk about kind of trans rights and things. It can seem like a generational thing, but I think it also reflects the fact that every new generation has these new challenges posed by maybe new technologies, but also new ways of looking at the world. And I think it's an incredible thing, really, that we have this ability to, tap into, we can tap into the internet and read about things happening on, parts of the world, or, my children. It's amazing what resources are at their fingertips, really. But probably the same human dilemmas of, growing up, meeting young people of your own age and worrying about your sexuality and the rest of it. These are probably, there's a kind of universal aspect to it in some ways, but not, because every generation, I think, is slightly different. And maybe that's the difference about being a a social species, and a species that's affected so much by our changing culture. Because whereas every other species, I would argue, although there are other species that do use tools to an extent, there's no other species that changed its culture so rapidly. So every generation, I presume that chimpanzees, living in the Congo, are living much the way they used to live, millions of years ago, apart from the effect of human culture on them, which is obviously potentially very catastrophic. But they haven't really changed, I don't think, in that sense. Whereas, although our biology, although there's a bit of debate about this when it comes to genetics, our biology is probably not that much different from when we were, living in caves and scratching the surface from the earth in 40,000 years ago. But clearly the difference in our culture and what technology we have, it's been able to read or write or use computers, must have an impact on our psyche. And in some ways, that's the kind of exciting thing about being human, is that every new generation has these amazing new things that someone just takes for granted. Like I'll worry about how to use an app on my phone. My daughter just laughs because it just comes so naturally to her. But equally, she's got challenges that I wouldn't have dreamed that are also potentially problematic. So that's the potential of being human, but also to some extent the pain as well. That you've got to face up to all these changing things, and it can be very destabilising actually, particularly when you think the planet's on a kind of a road to catastrophe. It's not surprising that young people can feel pretty, where's it all leading, sort of thing. And yet, being young, they just get on with it and think that the world's ours, I suppose.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to one of my helpers at the back, and then we've got an online question after that.
Just picking off that question and the fact that you mentioned previously, we live in an age where there's so much information, and in terms of machine learning approach, we're having so much more training data. So how can you foresee how this will affect the development of the brain in responding to this sort of overstimulation? How will that affect the working memory of people, say, in the distant future?
I mean, I think one thing we can say is that our tools are very much an extension of us. There is an idea about the mind that sees it as more than just the brain. It's the 4 E's. Doesn't mean that it's not embodied. I can't remember all the different parts now, but the point is that because we are a species that rely on technology, culture is kind of something we create around us using technologies. Then every new technology has an impact both on how we interact with the world. I'm using a microphone to talk to you. We're in a room with lights. We've used a computer to give a presentation. This is a major impact on the way we approach the world and the way we interact with the world. But it must, I think, impact on our minds as well. Now, how that works in terms of new forms of computer technology like machine learning, I suppose it's an extension of our tools, and hopefully it will allow us to extend our capacities and our ability to do good things in the world. Whether it's for instance, in my field of biochemistry, the fact now computers can predict protein structures to some extent is important, because of course that's a route to new drugs and that kind of thing. But equally, you could argue that it could be used in all sorts of different ways. Unfortunately, it's still true that around half of all scientific funding goes to the military. Developing new ways to kill people, and so how we use these powers and these technologies is kind of quite an important question to debate, really. How we use that potential. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Okay, so this is from Paul online. He says, there's been a lot of ideas that gut microbiome affects human thinking and brains via chemical signals, electrical signals, vagus nerve, and circadian rhythms. Do we know if this is unique, or does the microbiome affect animal brains in the same way? It's a big question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. It kind of relates to what I just said, really, about the fact that consciousness isn't just a product of the brain. Our bodies interact with our brains. I usually thought that the brain kind of just passed down signals to the organs, and it was kind of the master controller. And to some extent it is, but also we're starting to learn that those organs have all sorts of very sophisticated ways to interact with the rest of the body, with other organs, but also with the brain. The adipose tissue was thought to be just this, where you store fat. Well, actually, it's an important endocrine organ. It sends out hormones. They have impacts on the brain, the effect whether we have an appetite or whether we want to eat more and get obese, that kind of thing. Same with the stomach, the intestines, all these are playing the heart, all quite important agents sending out signals. And I suppose that means that the biome that's in the gut, all the bacteria, you know, I think about half of our body by cell number is bacteria. It's not the 90% that we used to think it was. That definitely must have an impact in a role, and people are starting to realise just how these things can be linked to good health or disease and so on and so forth. And of course, this has important implications when we think about diet, because one of the problems of, say, obesity is that becoming obese isn't just about getting fat to the extent that, you know, can incapacitate you or can make you unhealthy. It can alter the very hormonal balance of the body. And I would have thought if you've got a biome that's really not at its best, not at its optimum, that can have massive implications on, you know, not just the body, but all sorts of aspects of mental health as well. I'd be very surprised if animals didn't also have something similar going on. In fact, many of the studies that they've done to look at the biome have involved, you know, experimental species. There was a study I heard about where they had these mice that had been bred to have no bacteria in their gut at all, and actually they were incredibly susceptible to cancer, all sorts of things. So it showed the importance of these bacteria for those kind of things. So there'll be similarities in humans and other species in this respect, but like everything else, because the mind has got this kind of link with language, and in fact we have tools and the rest of it. Everything, even our basic functions, I would argue, are kind of transformed by this interaction we have with the world through tools and through language. So although the biome are very important, then we've got to factor into how does that work in terms of being human as opposed to being an animal. But that's one of the reasons why we can learn lots from experimental animal studies, despite the fact, you know, obviously it's not nice to have to experiment and kill an animal potentially. But we can learn lots, but we also have to then think of ways in which we can study human beings specifically. And I think this is an issue for the mind, because of course it's not easy to, you know, do everything you want to with a human being in terms of looking at the mind. You can't just open up the skull and put electrodes in and kind of see what's going on there. You've got to find more indirect ways. You've got to find obviously ways in which people consent to be an experiment on. But it is an issue, I think, in that so much of experimental psychology, to some extent by necessity, has tended to focus on animals. And I think that's partly based on the idea that there's really not necessarily that much difference between us and animals in terms of the way our mind works. But I would argue I'm not so sure about that. Certainly one of the main themes of my book is that there really is quite a qualitative shift between humans and animals. And if we really want to understand the mind, but I think all the other ways in which our body and mind interact, we do need to look at human beings. We need to find ways to somehow study human beings as well.
Anyone else in the room? Okay.
Yeah. A question from the chat.
Like the one I just asked, was it from earlier?
Yes. The one from Morris Herson.
So again, online, this one says, we're a little bit off the mainstream of the presentation. Do non-human animals have consciousness that is similarly affected by the kind of aspects addressed here, like societal interaction, etc.?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's definitely true that other species have consciousness. I guess it depends what you mean by consciousness. For me in the book, I wanted specifically to look at the kind of human consciousness that allows us to have conceptual thoughts, to have the kind of deep, you know, to plan things, to rationalize. And I would stick to the idea that kind of conceptual thought is specific to humans. Only language can give us the ability to distinguish past, present and future, my location versus another location, you versus me, all those things. In my latest book, I try to tackle this idea about whether any other species have selfhood. And there are some interesting studies that have seemed to indicate that, you know, other non-human primates have a sort of sense of self. And I have to say that from looking at the experiments in detail, I'm not convinced. I think they're based on some quite interesting studies, but ones which I think are quite flawed for reasons I can't really go into now. So I think it's definitely true that kind of language based to our consciousness gives us a kind of consciousness that really is qualitatively unique, and that's why I call the book Mind Shift. That's not to say that other species, and particularly non-human primates, don't have some amazing ability to interact socially I think there are very sophisticated ways of interacting that you could argue there's a kind of consciousness that's pre-verbal, but might kind of have the sense in which they can have an idea about what, say, another chimpanzee might be about to do, and based on past experience, that kind of thing. That's quite sophisticated behaviour, but I would argue it's different from the kind of conceptual thought that we have. Of course, then you could keep, you could go into other species, more simple organisms, and there's a kind of consciousness there. It's been argued that bacteria have a kind of consciousness. Well, I think that may be pushing it too far, really. Certainly, bacteria interact with the environment in quite sophisticated ways, but I wouldn't really call that consciousness. So I certainly buy the idea there's a kind of levels of consciousness, but I think I'm against the idea there's just a spectrum and it's just a gradation, you know, and there isn't this qualitative leap from animals from, say, chimps to humans, which I think is really quite controversial, actually. I know there's quite a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily agree on this, so that's kind of one of the things I've really tried to tackle in this new book about consciousness, actually, trying to counter all the arguments that why, you know, that we're not really that different.
Can I ask, have you looked at animal species that have quite sophisticated forms of communication? There are some that seem to communicate with sounds that are making something that's much closer to a language that we would recognise as one.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I mean, animals communicate. No, I think one of the kind of misunderstandings about the importance of human language and its specifically unique role is to see it as just communication, whereas I would argue that the words, this ability to give abstract symbolic names to objects or emotions or in fact are more complex things. Actually, it doesn't have to be names in a verbal sense. People who are deaf have a language that is equally sophisticated and conceptually based. That has a massive impact on the way that our consciousness works, because it develops a structure of between these kind of symbolic forms. You could call it, we're a symbolic species, I think you could say. And it's not really just about the fact we can then link an object to a symbol. It's the way these symbols are brought together in a very specific way. So grammar, we tend to think of grammar as, you know, things we learn at school. We have to learn the verb endings and these kind of things, and, you know, infinitive and subjunctive. But really, grammar is actually key to understanding how human thought is different, because grammar, I think Noam Chomsky really has showed it in important ways. It's a very important thing because it allows us to talk about past, present and future and me versus you and all these other kind of things, conceptual underpinnings that we take for granted, in a way that I don't think any other species can have, because they don't have that grammatical system. Now, the interesting thing is you can teach chimpanzees and gorillas to associate an object with a word. You know, that's in the 70s. There's a lot of talk about the fact they were basically teaching chimps and gorillas language, but there's no evidence that I can see that they actually were using those symbols in that kind of structured way that we have. Sometimes they would link, you know, two symbols together, and, you know, and that was thought to be similar, but it wasn't really, and it also wasn't spontaneous. It had to be almost linked to reward and those kind of things. Now, in the wild, I think it's true that animals can have sophisticated means of communication. There was a study recently where they looked at chimps using, I don't know what they were doing now, there was something in the way they kind of shaped leaves or something, or anyway, they had ways to kind of communicate emotions and feelings and maybe even objects, but I don't think there was any sense at all that it was anything like the grammatical system that we have. So in that sense, although animal communication is probably incredibly sophisticated and incredibly incredibly sophisticated, and we shouldn't underestimate it, it's really quite different from human language. Actually, probably what we have lost is all the things that animals do in terms of body language. You know, you think about the ways that wild animals probably interact. They kind of, imagine when my cat goes out into the garden, they kind of sense it's picking up, or the kind of the little rustles and sounds and things that we might ignore because we're so used to using words and our technologies as a medium that we've probably forgotten a lot of that kind of ways of interacting with the world. You know, there's this thing about why some animal species seem to be able to detect disasters, and they realise that what these animals are doing is, I think that one of them picks up on something happening, like a volcano or a flood or something, and then the others, because they're so attuned to each other and to, you know, that interaction they have, then they all act together. So in a sense, that they're probably much better at picking up on things in the natural world that we've kind of lost. So being a verbal species, being a kind of conceptual species,
is brilliant in some ways. We probably lost all sorts of other aspects of it. Actually, I talk in my book about, in the chapter looking at, there's a bit where I talk about film theory and the ways that film was first developed in the early 20th century. And there was actually a Russian film director, film producer, who was quite friendly with Lev Vygotsky, the Russian scientist I mentioned earlier on, who specifically tried to find a kind of way of developing, his name Eisenstein, who was one of the pioneers of film. And one of the things that he tried to do was to kind of go back to that more primeval way of interacting with the world by linking sound and movement and all these things that in the ways that we don't tend to do with our structured conceptual way of looking at the world. So there's a lot to be gained from kind of going back to a more simple animal-like way of working with the world that maybe would be also quite a beneficial thing from a health point of view. But it is the one thing I think that is, that is different about humans, is that we do it because everything's mediated through language and technology. That completely changed the way we see the world, and that really is quite a unique thing.
I'm going to be very mean and cut us off now, because if I don't, we won't get out of the building or get locked in all night. So thank you very much for that. I think that's a positive end to end on, which is probably a good idea. Quite a lot of thank yous, obviously to Pharmacology and to all my helpers, Leo, who's the boss of the team, to Kelly, to Joshua, to Zoe, to Nicholas, who've been amazing. It's their first time setting up, and in a minute it's back for their first time clearing up, so thank you in advance, guys. To all of you for coming, to those of you who came online as well, we might tinker a little bit with how we try the mics. I think we've got some good solutions. We've got the speaker much closer to the iPad this time, so halfway through the night that worked, so that's good. We'll just keep going and see if it works. The next cafe will go on the second, so if you haven't grasped it, we work on the second Tuesday of every month except August. Occasionally you have to swerve it. We are at the moment planning to do Valentine's Day just because that's the second Tuesday in February. I apologise in advance. But as you can see, we're finishing a little earlier than we used to, so hopefully people can go for dinner afterwards. The aim is to get the people who've been developing a laser-driven breath testing machine to come in January. That's the aim. So I think it's the 10th, but don't quote me, you can look it up. It's the second Tuesday of the month, sufficiently after New Year to work fairly well. One announcement to make about people as they're going. Be aware that you just need to wait until the receptionist is there to let you out, because this is a fully locked building. We don't have an exit button. There's quite a lot of important research in here, so they can't let people open the door and let anyone else in. So you need to wait if he's on his rounds. They do know when we're finishing, so hopefully that will work. And please do take any open and particularly perishable snacks with you if you want to. You're very welcome to, because we need otherwise to get it all in my car. Biggest thanks, of course, is to John for being the brave person who started our new cafe and for supporting something in pharmacology. I hope he'll feel like he can occasionally drop in from now on and come and listen to other people. We will try and make it better next time. I apologise for deficiencies this time, but a very big thank you to John.
Thank you.